Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another GINSA webinar. I'm Jonathan Rui, GINSA's Director of Foreign Policy. Today, we'll be discussing recent events relating to Saudi Arabia's decision over the weekend to cut 10% of its oil output, or 1 million barrels per day, for at least the month of July and possibly longer. This announcement came soon after a deal between OPEC and its partners to maintain current production targets for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Saudi Arabia this week, where he met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to discuss a range of strategic issues, including potential normalization between the kingdom and Israel, potentially with U.S. facilitation. Here to discuss what this all means for international energy markets, for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its relationship with the United States, as well as a range of other key national security issues, I'm fortunate, as always, to be joined by GINSA's own John Hannah and Larry Goldstein. John Hannah is the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow here at Archimunder Center for Defense and Strategy. Previously, he served in senior foreign policy positions for both Democratic and Republican administrations, including as the National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney. We're also fortunate to be joined by Larry Goldstein, one of the foremost energy experts in America today. He is the Director of Special Projects at the Energy Policy Research Foundation, Inc., as well as a Senior Advisor to GINSA's Gemunder Center, where he also serves as a member of our Iran Policy Project. And Larry is also the former boss of my current boss, so another connection here to the work at GINSA. For our audience, please feel free to type any questions you may have into the Q&A box on your screen, and I'll be sure to get to them as quickly as I can. Larry, I'd like to start with you, but before we dive into the particular topic that's the title and focus of today's webinar, I was wondering if you could perhaps briefly explain for our audience what sort of more globally what changes you're seeing in the global oil market. Given that we hear a lot about how the United States has become a net energy exporter, and then also we've seen sort of perhaps a redrawing of the map in terms of energy flows since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. So I was wondering if we could just start sort of the 30,000-foot level and what big changes you're seeing.
First of all, I want to thank you for having me back. I guess it does prove that you can fool some of the people all of the time. But the oil markets is in a major transition, primarily for political reasons. There's a dramatic move afoot to phase out fossil fuels. There's been a misnomer since the Trump administration that we are energy independent, and leaving the impression that we're oil independent. We are energy independent. With our coal production, we provide 100%. We provide most of our natural gas, and we import 6 to 8 million barrels a day of oil. We're producing 12 million barrels of crude oil. We produced 13 in 2019. So under the current policies, we've seen a loss of over 1 million barrels a day of U.S. productions, primarily from shale. But our consumption is 21 million barrels a day and holding steady. We've had some minor growth because the economy has been kind of in what I call a growth recession. And this is something the Saudis look at very carefully. It's one of the 4 things that they focus on. A growth recession is really when you're growing below potential. It almost doesn't matter whether we go into a modest recession or not, because we're growing at a very anemic rate at best. So that keep in mind that our oil consumption is 21 million barrels a day, and our import and our crude oil production is 12. Now we produce natural gas liquids, and there's processing gains. So the balance is not the 21 minus 12, but it leaves a big gap that has to be imported. And primarily those imports come now at the margin from the Middle East. The other big change is, again, political. Over the last 6 months, we've seen tremendous inroads being made by the Iranians and the Chinese in that part of the world. The US now is aware of what's going on. Hopefully they were aware. And it seems to me now they're playing catch up. We need the Saudis. The Saudis know that, but the Saudis also need us. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship there. We're also seeing a major uncertainty. And that's the second question. The US recession is the first question on the Saudis' mind. The second question is, China is the key in 2023. There's tremendous difference of opinion as to what Chinese oil demand will be this year. We have held steady for a growth forecast of 750,000 barrels a day, over 40% of our forecasted growth in global oil demand. But the IEA and private institutions and banks have been forecasting 1 million to 1.2 million barrels a day. The IEA just revised up their outlook. We don't see where that's coming from. We see that the Chinese exports are declining, their imports are low, and there's a shift within China from being an industrial economy more towards a consumption-based economy, which is less energy intensive. So the key to whether oil prices recover or not lies in part whether China's oil demand will recover in the second half of the year. We believe there will be some recovery compared to the first half, but nothing like what is the general perceived view out there. The Saudis seem to know that because of any oil producing country, they know what's best, what's going on real term in China. China was taking advantage of Russian production, cheap oil. They were storing it. So there's a difference between demand for China and consumption. Their demand has been relatively strong, but they've been storing it. Their consumption has not been keeping pace with the conventional view out there. And that's the second question. The third question on the Saudis' mind is really whether the US will go into recession or not, and whether they can get the Russians to at least be more transparent in their production. And they want to put together a group of outside players to bring about that transparency. The oil minister, who's a brilliant tactician, I think made a major mistake at this last meeting. In April of this year, 24 hours before their meeting, he said there would be no cut in production. They go into the meeting 24 hours later, and he shocks the world. He offers a cut of 1.1 million barrels a day among a number of OPEC countries, and the Russians commit to keep their promise on the 500,000 barrel a day cut, which they haven't done. Oil minister also loves to punish the non-physical oil traders. He says that very publicly. This time around, he didn't surprise anybody. He wanted to put them on a nervous track. Will he or won't he? You know, it's like the question, will the Fed stay or will they go? Will the Saudis stay or will they? And he wanted the market unbalanced at that time for what he believed would force the shorts to cover their position to boost oil prices up. But he was out there exposed so clearly that a cut was coming. And by the way, our foundation forecasted months ago that there would be a cut. So we got that part right, but not the way it came about. The way it came about has totally shocked us. They agreed to a cut of 1 million barrels a day, which structurally should support the market. It should give it a solid base. They didn't get any help from any other producer. Not Kuwait, not the UAE, not the Iraqis, which is unprecedented. They have always got some cooperation, real, by the way, from some other producers.
Mhm.
But I sense the other producers saw that the Saudis were boxed and they forced him to go it alone. Now, here's the problem. The Saudis cut 1 million barrels a day. We put out a note right after the meeting. It was called Russian lollipop. Now, that was what the oil minister used in describing why they went 1 million barrels a day. I had no idea what he meant, but I looked up lollipop in the dictionary, and it's a hard candy on a stick or sucker. And I concluded in my note, and it was probably more aggressive than it should have been, that the sucker this time around with the Saudis. The Russians played them. They are the major beneficiaries of the cut, and they didn't ante up a barrel. And that's something I think the Saudis have to do over the next 30 days, is to get the Russians to commit to two things: a willingness to be more transparent in what they're doing, and an actual physical cut, visible cut, not by the 500,000 that they've committed to, but some important number. One of the big problems, and it's a major problem, by the Saudis doing what they just did, I call it the equivalent of sitting down at a poker table with every one of their cards face up. They typically export 7.5 million barrels a day of crude oil. They went to about 7 when they agreed to the cut in May, which they did cut. This cut takes them to 5.6 million barrels a day, an unprecedented number. They have almost nowhere to go now in terms of leverage on the other producers, in terms of further cuts. So what is their leverage? Their leverage is two things. They have spare capacity now because they did cut, which they could use qualitatively as leverage on the producers by saying, if you don't come along, then we have no reason not to produce the oil we have. I doubt that they would actually implement that. The threat of it would be more important than the actual implementation of it. The other thing is the 1 million barrel a day cut is only for 1 month.
Mhm.
If they don't get cooperation from the Russians, Kuwait, and the UAE and Iraq at a minimum, I think the Saudis go back to that 1 million. Now, why is that important? When the minister cut 1 million barrels a day, the market believed you'd see an instantaneous rise in oil prices of $3 to $6 a barrel. We put out a note that suggested the overhang in supply, and we put this note out initially in August of 22, would lead to a very weak market through June of this year. After June, we see inventory starting to decline at a fast enough rate to tighten the market, again predicated on China. If China continues to lag, then we're going to see prices floating in the low 70s, maybe mid 75. In an environment where China demand improves in July and August is when we see strength. You could see an $80, $85 Brent price. We don't believe the banks forecast and a lot of the private investment houses of 90 to 100 is going to be realized. We think that's a gross exaggeration. The demand across the world has been disappointing, but particularly up till now in China. And China is one of the variables they have to look at. The Saudis, if they want to stabilize prices, must get some cooperation from the Russians. They have leverage in terms of the spare capacity, which I don't think they're going to use. They have some more important leverage in the fact that they could bring back the 1 million barrels of cuts, which are temporary, just for July. And since oil prices not only haven't moved, they've probably been slightly down since the oil minister announced his 1 million barrel a day cut, which probably has shocked them. We think that 1 million barrels will weigh heavily on the market. Now, the problem you have to really ask yourself, in fairness to the Saudis, Since the minister made a big deal of a cut, where would prices be if he didn't follow through? So you can't just look at today's prices. You got to make a guess as to where they would be had he not cut. Our sense is they probably would have been $3 to $5 a barrel lower than currently exist. So that's something to keep in mind. But the Saudis lost the leverage of raising prices through further cuts with their 5.6 million barrel a day net export number. That's a number you haven't seen anywhere. I did a lot of arithmetic to come to that number. Now, the other thing that really has troubled the Saudis, but they've been largely quiet about it, is that Russia lost the European market, about 3 million barrels a day of crude that has now gone on the water. India, which imported a couple of 100,000 barrels a day a year ago, is now importing 2 million barrels a day. China has increased their imports. Turkey has increased their imports. The Saudis, interestingly, on the product side, are importing products from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process of Russia redirecting the flow of oil, they've taken 2 million barrels a day of market share away from the Saudis in the Middle East. The Middle East is the Saudi strongest market. In the United States, they sell 350, 400,000 barrels a day. They're pricing their oil way out of the market. They don't care about the US market. In Europe, they picked up a little bit of market share as the Russians pulled out, but they lost 2 million barrels a day of market share in Asia because of the way the Russians are pricing. Now, just one point that has nothing to do with the general conversation. Secretary of Treasury has made a lot about the Russian cap of $60. We believe the cap has had an influence on prices. But people forget that oil prices a year ago were 22% higher than today. That's one of the major reasons Russian revenue is down, has nothing to do with the cap. The fact that the Russians redirected the flow of oil from Europe to Asia is an increase in transportation costs of $5. And the Russians' price of Urals was always discounted relative to Brent. So our sense is the 45% reduction in Russian revenue, probably about 30% is due to the cap. So I'm going to stop there unless there are questions.
Well, it's sort of plenty of follow-up questions that sort of prioritize them before we turn to John. So Larry, you mentioned, Saudi Arabia would like to get some more transparency from Russia, and to me, when I hear Russia and transparency, it kind of sounds like an oxymoron. But certainly last fall, in October, where you had the OPEC plus production cut, it seemed like Saudi Arabia and Russia were pretty closely aligned, or at least that's what seemed to be America's reaction to the situation. What do you see as potentially the prospects for Saudi actually getting that transparency from Russia and maybe closer alignment between them going forward?
To me, outside of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, you can't believe what any of the oil ministers say. So if the Russians simply were to suggest they are going to start to cooperate, that would be a stabilizing factor. But the Saudis this time around must get cooperation from some of the oil producers. They can't and they won't go it alone, which sets the market up for major shocks and volatility.
So I'm sort of jumping around to various questions I thought of while you made your opening remarks. I've seen in a lot of the American press that perhaps maybe differently than how you explained it, that the Saudis made this move partly to prop up prices because they have a break-even price at home that they're very mindful of because they're funding a lot of ambitious changes at home. What's your reaction to that assessment that the Saudis made this cut just to prop up prices?
Historically, I tended to dismiss break-even prices. They don't really have much meaning. You could look at the Saudi economy and take the oil revenue and put it over a divisor, and you come up with an $80 oil price. The Saudis have a target of at least 80. But this time around, you have to take it seriously. We're doing some work with an entity called PIF, That's the public investment vehicle for the Saudi government.
One that just took over, the one that just took over World Golf.
That's right.
Hmm.
That's right. And the guy who's going to be the chairman of that is the chairman of Aramco. But the point is, MBS is totally committed, and we've seen this internally in a conversation that involved it in a project we're working on over there. It's totally committed to his 2030 project. And in this area called Neom, I don't know if you know it, NEOM, they are starting from scratch in the desert, and they're going to be building cities, entertainment centers, hotels. They want to be the tourist attraction in the Middle East. They want to replace Abu Dhabi and Dubai. They want to be the focus of entertainment and tourism. And they have committed to build hundreds of thousands of residences over there, working on a fuel pump type of project over there with them. They need to raise $7 trillion over that period of time. And there's no other way they can get it done. This time, that's why this time around, you take their oil objective seriously. However, they need cooperation from the other producers to get there. Interestingly, over the last several years, after 2020, despite the higher price and now lower price, global oil demand has been inelastic. It's 1.8 to 2 million barrels a day. It was that number in 21. It was that number in 22. And most people are forecasting a 1.8 to 2.1 million barrels a day in 23. Oil is not going away, but neither is supply. U.S. production is probably growing 600,000 to 700,000 barrels a day all by itself. And we think that OPEC needs to maintain discipline on their output. And what you're going to have is Iran probably is going to come back in some form. Venezuela is probably going to come back in some form. Nigeria is going to come back in some form. So how do you rein in production from the group is still their problem. And the leverage that the Saudis have because of the collapse in their net exports makes the market very vulnerable.
Hey, Jonathan, can I just jump in on this question of
course, please.
of the issue of the Saudi budget, whether it's 80 or plus, and how seriously they take it? This is anecdotal, but I don't know if the audience knows, JINSA led a delegation to Riyadh back last November and had a lot of discussions with a lot of very important people. And it was right after the October decision by OPEC Plus to cut 2 million barrels per day. And that was the last time we had Larry Goldstein on, who presented a master course on why the Saudis had taken the steps they took and why it made sense and why the U.S. Reaction to it was dramatically over the top at that time. What we heard in Riyadh in November was that it was true that the Saudis had agreed with the U.S. back before the summer of 2022 that prices were increasing, that the Saudis would begin to take steps to try and stabilize the market by adding barrels, and you then proceeded to see a drop in prices, certainly at the U.S. pump throughout the summer of 2022. Come September, the Saudi oil minister allegedly came to the leadership in Saudi Arabia at that time and said, we see the prices declining right now. They've been declining for a period of several months. We're not sure exactly where the floor is, whether it's 80, whether it's 70. At which point the finance minister in a meeting of their council of ministers told the crown prince that, that if prices did go dramatically under 70, that there would begin to be a real threat to their ability fiscally to sustain everything that the Crown Prince wanted to do as part of Vision 2030, including in particular the project that Larry talks about at NEOM and this idea of a more than 100-mile long linear city that is slated to populate up to 9 million people in it along that Red Sea coast, or leading to that Red Sea coast. At which point, informed of that this could really begin to jeopardize what was happening in oil markets to Vision 2030 and his ability to execute on time all the projects that he had going. The Crown Prince made a decision that he would have to begin reversing whatever understandings he had with the United States. He immediately got on the phone and informed the administration that he was regretfully going to have to perhaps make some moves, at which point in time they engaged in a 20-day or 3-week argument about what was the immediate future of international energy markets, where was price going, what would be the impact of a major cut in production, with the administration predicting we would go through $100 a barrel fairly quickly, and it would have all kinds of political implications in the United States and instability and in international markets, and be a big boon for the Russians. The Saudis argued vociferously the counter position that the sky wasn't about to fall if they had to take this action based on their understanding of energy markets. And lo and behold, when we showed up in November with the price at the pump actually lower in the United States than it was at the time OPEC Plus made their decision in early October, the Saudis clearly felt very vindicated. But it did underscore, at least for me, the premium they were now putting on this issue of their ability to sustain this very, very ambitious program of internal domestic transformation that they have underway.
Well, just one comment, because I agree with everything you said, because we were in writing on most of this, and Michael has many of the pieces that we put out, particularly the one in August 22, where we talked about a weak oil market. But the Saudis, at the time that you were referring to, production was 11 million barrels a day. Then there was an agreement where they cut it to 10.486 to be exact. And then they cut it to 10. And now they're at 9. They run about 2.7 to 2.8 million barrels a day of crude oil in their own refineries. You deduct that from the 9. Their direct crude oil burn in the summertime is about 600,000 barrels a day. They use a lot of crude oil for electric generation. You deduct that and you come out with your number. And it's a very ugly situation, because they're no longer at 11 million with, by the way, almost no spare capacity to now 9, and they can't go lower with spare capacity.
Larry, do you take seriously, or do you believe that this commitment, or the greater commitment they now have to, getting the revenues necessary to sustain the momentum of Vision 2030, undermines Saudi leverage with the other producers? Do they all know that the threat of the Saudis doing what they did, anything close to it, what they did in March of 2020, when the oil minister said this is a question of to be or not to be, us against the Russians, and we're going to show the Russians who's number one in this global oil game. Do you think their current situation, their commitment to Vision 2030, really hurts their leverage further in their negotiations?
Definitely, because now, while they're the swing producer, they also are desperately in need for the revenue, We're actually waiting to see, we're in conversation with the head of their real estate division on what projects may have to be postponed or canceled. We don't think they can meet the full commitment in the time frame that they set out.
So this has been a great discussion. I want to sort of pick through a little bit more. Larry, you mentioned at the outset that one of the big trends globally is a pivot away from fossil fuels, or something in that direction. To what extent do you think, and John, please follow up if you feel so compelled. To what extent, I mean, Saudi Arabia is at least sort of rhetorically positioning itself to be sort of a big player in the future post fossil fuel world too, right?
Oh, very real, very large. Most of the projects in NEOM are with renewables, not even natural gas, with renewables. And they're going big time, big way. We think they'll change to some degree at the margin, some gas turbines as backup to what they have. But by and large, they are fully committed over there. There's a very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago. I had reported on this back in December and January. The chairman of Toyota gave a speech, and he talked about how many mines would have to be opened up to meet the EV forecast. Yeah. And they were infinite, not doable. Lithium, we may come up with an alternative, but there's no alternative copper. And the amount of copper required exceeds the resource base that exists. Secondly, he put out 3 pieces of data which absolutely floored me, and no one seems to pick it up or pay any attention to it. One EV uses the amount of materials that would go into 6 hybrid EVs or 90 hybrids. One EV consumes the amount of material that otherwise could produce 90 hybrids. And over the life of the 90 hybrids versus the one EV, a 37 times reduction in carbon. It's coming from the chairman of a major automobile producer, Toyota. I tried to get that information out there, and no one cares. Nobody cares.
Toyota produces a pretty good hybrid, I would say. So.
And by the way, they are committed themselves to the plug-in EVs as well. So it's not that they're just trying to fight the EVs in total. They realize it's coming, it's growing. But the environmental cost, when you look at it from a cradle to grave process, is not being paid attention to. 37 times the reduction in carbon emissions.
Yeah, Jonathan, the only thing I would agree with Larry that they're going big time into renewables, including EVs, where they are a major investor in a particular EV company, a high-end EV company called Lucid, I believe, that they've the PIF has gone into in a very serious way. The one other area of renewables that has much bigger implications strategically that they at least claim they are very committed to developing is a civil nuclear power industry as well, that they see that very much in the renewable category. They see it as a way to move themselves internally off of any kind of oil or fossil fuel consumption for their own electricity, as enhancing their ability to monetize their own oil for export while the getting is good over the next a few decades. And, the civil nuclear issue and the development of a very robust industry is one of the major subjects that the Saudis have clearly raised in the context of normalization in terms of things they would like ahead of time for the U.S. to commit to becoming a major partner of the Saudis in developing that particular capability, including obviously some controversial elements having to do with an ability to master the nuclear fuel cycle and to have some kind of option to indigenously enrich uranium for power reactors at some point in the future if they feel a need to do that to sustain and exploit that industry.
The last time I heard civilian nuclear, I was at a private meeting with Lavrov. It was a discussion about Iran, how they were going to go civilian nuclear. At the time, there was no LNG market, but Iran has at least the second largest reserves of natural gas. And they were going to commit to themselves to this major capital investment, foreign laborers, while they were flaring gas in the fields because they had nowhere to go with it, not willing to use it for their power generation, but it was going to be all civilian.
So I so much to touch on here, and I want to get back to some of the issues John raised about the more strategic look at U.S.-Saudi relationship. But first, Larry, I'd be remiss if I didn't follow up with something on Iran, even though it's, I guess, a little bit tangential to the formal topic of today's discussion, but very core to a lot of the work JINSA does. Could you give our audience an appreciation of where you see Iran's oil exports and the effect or lack of effect of U.S. sanctions on the sector, because it's so central to a lot of policy discussions that JINSA is involved in?
There seems to be conversation primarily led by the administration to kind of bring about a change in U.S.-Iranian relations. The Iranians, like the Chinese, are a major negative player vis-a-vis U.S. interests. The Iranians and the Chinese will undermine us every way they can, wherever they can. The Iranians now are trying to negotiate with the Russians on an international gas hub where they will control the price of natural gas. The Iranians just set up a flagging process with the Middle East producers in terms of shipping to guarantee the safety of it. The UAE was very upset at the United States a couple of months ago when a couple of vessels were taken over by the Iranians. They asked the US to come in and give them some backbone and support. They didn't get it. And the Iranians now are trying to give it to them. Same thing in Yemen. We were trying to have the conversation in Yemen, and we pulled out, and the Iranians stepped right in there. The Saudis desperately want an answer to Yemen.
And I would just point out to our audience, on Monday, JINSA released a brief on the issue of Iran's seizure of tankers in the Strait of Hormuz and the broader issue of maritime security in the Middle East. So Larry, just one final question on this. Given that Iran has been interfering with international shipping in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, have you seen any effect in terms of a risk premium affecting prices at all, given this interference with energy flows?
Not yet. We follow that through the shipping market, and we've seen none as of yet.
As of yet.
Jonathan, can I just ask Larry on the question of Iranian? There have been claims that Iranian exports have been increasing, particularly to China. There's a lack of sanctions enforcement by the administration. How much of that, Larry, the lack of enforcement against Iran has to do with concerns about, given the administration's discomfort with the higher price of oil than maybe a few years ago, how much are they worried that if they were to really crack down on Iranian exports of oil, that it would really hurt Americans at the pump if you began taking more Iranian oil off the market?
Well, even if we didn't import Iranian oil, prices are set in the global market. You take out a 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day of exports from the market anywhere, you raise price. And there's almost no ability for all the other producers to make that volume up. You know, I talked about a growth in the United States of 600,000 barrels a day, but we're producing effectively at 100% of capacity. The only one with any measurable, visible spare capacity are the Saudis. The other thing that I think is important, because one way or the other, it's going to play out in the oil markets. is China. China is in every way, shape, or form our enemy. There's no good in any relationship other than our short-term dependency on a lot of the things that they supply to us. If, in fact, we were serious, we're at war for all intents and purposes through Ukraine. Why are we allowing the Russians to sell oil? If we want to hurt their economy, which is what we're doing, if we want to bring an end to the war, we got to create as much pain as possible, both militarily as well as economically. But the over concern of the price increase at the pump is what has kept that back. And I think the same thing goes along with Iran.
I wonder if there's any possibility of a deal to be had if the administration was prepared to really begin to enforce sanctions against illicit Iranian oil shipments under our sanctions, at least, and really go after some of the countries purchasing from Iran. That the Saudis would be prepared to try and make up some of that difference.
I think they definitely would, because, as I said, they've lost 2 million barrels of a market share in Asia where the Iranians sell their oil. By the way, at the same time, I don't understand our SPR policy. I don't understand our policy vis-a-vis Venezuela. We ought to be buying oil at these prices. We sold 220 million barrels last year at $95 a barrel, and we are still reluctant to buy it back at 70. Makes no sense. Makes no sense.
Larry, my hobby horse on the Ukraine war. I see your point on the Russian oil and really clamping down on it in a much harder way to stop it. And but just I get, they're worried about price at the pump. They're worried about what happens in Europe and Japan and how strong those countries will continue to be if they see a dramatic increase in price. What really gets me, my hobby horse, has been, okay, we're basically at war in Ukraine. It's a vital American interest that Russia be seen to lose this war, that it be seen to be a failure by Putin for all kinds of reasons, not just including the stability of Europe, but certainly a Taiwan scenario and what the Chinese see happening. And yet we are allowing our worst adversary in the Middle East, Iran, to be the country that is the major outside weapons supplier to the Russians trying to defeat U.S. interest in Ukraine. And we're beyond some symbolic sanctions on various Iranian entities that produce drones and facilitate the transfer of drones to Ukraine. The United States has not been prepared, that I see, either covertly or overtly, to really go after the Iranian. I
think the U.S. will not go after the Iranian production and will not enforce sanctions. However, because the Saudi spare capacity now is 2.5 to 3 million barrels a day, that's all that the Russians are selling now into Asia. The Saudis could win back their lost market share. We can cut the Russian oil exports out of the market and still have about the same balance, because I think the Saudis would be willing to increase their production to offset the Russian loss. But for some reason, we're not doing it.
So I want to use this as a way to sort of head toward some of the more strategic look at the region and the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. So John, I'll pivot to you. Even though a production cut like Saudi just undertook is probably not music to the Biden administration's ears, it seems like there's been a regular parade of high-level officials from the administration going to Saudi Arabia, including Secretary Blinken just earlier this week. I guess, to what extent is Saudi Arabia's recent shift toward, for lack of a better term, a more non-aligned policy, putting some daylight between themselves and at least this administration, on a whole range of issues. To what extent do you think that has maybe cajoled the administration into trying to reinvest more in the relationship, or do you see some other dynamic here at work?
Well, I think it's a significant factor, Jonathan. In my own view, I think the Saudis have leveraged this issue very in a very, very smart way in terms of their diplomacy, the kinds of actions they're taking, particularly that deal that the Chinese brokered and brought across the finish line between the Saudis and the Iranians, and then the Saudi activities on Syria in particular, and some other issues. I think the administration is worried that the Chinese are really advancing in the Middle East, and they at least see that they cannot be seen to be ceding the Middle East to the Chinese. So I think it's no accident that in the wake of that, you've got Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, going together with some of his top aides and assistants, and then Secretary Blinken going on a 3-day visit to the kingdom. You were seeing a lot more, at least press reporting, about stories about the administration really energizing its activity in the normalization space between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, I think a lot of that has been overdone and overplayed, but you did have Senator Lindsey Graham, who said he would never meet with MBS again after the Khashoggi affair, but once MBS very cleverly purchased $35 or $36 billion worth of Boeing planes that in large part are built out of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham was very quickly on a plane to Saudi Arabia, had a long meeting with the Crown Prince, came out extremely enthusiastic about prospects for Israel-Saudi normalization, but that the key was in the U.S.-Saudi bilateral dimension, that the Crown Prince needed much more confidence that if he was to take a significant step toward Israel, he would, in return, be able to mitigate some of the risks he faced by getting something significant and big and long-term and sustainable in the U.S.-Saudi bilateral relationship, particularly in the security sphere. And we can talk about his demands if we want to. And I think the administration at least believes there may be an opportunity. They don't have a lot of positive diplomatic victories to show beyond sustaining the coalition in support of Ukraine, but outside of Europe, there's not a lot for them to show. If they were able to get something on the Saudi-Israel front, it really would be a transformative event on the lines of the Egyptian-Israel peace treaty 40 years ago. So I think it's attractive to them. I think there are people within the administration, particularly in the context of the competition with China, who see that this would be a very good thing for the United States to reassert its role as the central diplomatic player in the Middle East. And yet the big question mark is, has the president of the United States himself, who's going to be an absolutely central critical piece of this puzzle, is he internalized that he's prepared to commit the time and energy and resources to doing what's necessary with a man and a country he said he wanted to turn into pariahs just a couple of years ago? Is he willing to do what's necessary to really get this relationship back on track and to pay some significant political price within the left wing of his own party in advance of a presidential election next year to really make some progress on that? And I think that's a big question mark that we still don't really have an answer to.
It seems that our policy has been reactive, not anticipatory. About 6 months ago, China and Iran and Russia just put together a Pacific trade agreement that included the Saudis, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, a major trading pact that touches about 40% of the world's population and we sat visibly by just watching. I think the fact that it appears now that we have woken up to some degree about the importance of the region, and particularly Saudi Arabia, is good news. Now we'll see whether they're willing to follow it up.
Yeah, this is something that JINSA's work on the Abraham Accords that John has led has been a recurring theme, which is as significant as these strategic breakthroughs, diplomatic breakthroughs are, the United States still has to show up in order to facilitate and incentivize, and as John mentioned, show that if the countries of the region are going to take these big political risks, they'll have the United States behind them. So I guess, John, just a kind of a follow-up question. We mentioned some of the reservations that Saudi leadership has about whether the United States will indeed show up. We've also heard recently publicly that the Saudis want something on the Palestinian front. Could you maybe explain for our audience what that might be, and is that something that they're looking for the U.S. to help facilitate?
Well, this is a bit, it's a bit of a mystery. I can't say I've got definitive answers for you, Jonathan, on this whole question of how the Palestinian piece plugs into this U.S., Saudi, Israel normalization process. I can tell you, when we were in Riyadh in November, we got this distinct feeling that the Palestinian issue was not a priority, that the Saudi leadership understood that at some point it was in their interest to normalize with Israel. They still had a domestic population to deal with. They still had an Iranian backlash against any normalization that they would have to manage. And they wanted things in order to mitigate those risks. And everything that they talked about and were focused on was in the context of bolstering their confidence in the strategic relationship with the United States as their core military and security partner in that part of the world. When it came to discussions of the Palestinians, we were certainly led to believe at that point in time that while they still had a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian people, they thought they had a Palestinian leadership that was largely incapable of making any kind of diplomatic progress in the near term. And they were loath, to do what they'd done for the last 60 years and kind of hold hostage their ability to normalize with what is now the Middle East dominant military power, most effective intelligence service, probably most dynamic economy, particularly in the high-tech field. They clearly see an interest in normalization with Israel, given the Iranian problem in particular. They didn't want these two issues, normalization on one hand and the need for a resolution of the Palestinian problem. They didn't want to link those anymore. They wanted to limit the linkage as much as possible. Now, I got to say, we've seen recent reporting suggesting that there will have to be, as part of recent discussions, people are determining there will have to be some kind of Palestinian component to this piece, to any kind of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And the question is are the Saudis raising those demands on the Palestinian issue? Are they introducing this into the conversation? Or is it the Biden administration, the left wing of the Democratic Party, who are insisting that we need to use normalization as the last best chance to get Israeli concessions to keep alive the so-called two-state solution? And therefore, from a Saudi perspective, if the administration is pushing that angle very, very hard, it's hard for the Saudis to be less pro-Palestinian than an American government. So I think it would put them in a difficult position if they've got a U.S. administration insisting that as part of their demands for moving forward, some concession be made on the Palestinian element. Now, whether that's something very, very symbolic, just restarting a direct bilateral negotiation, having the prime minister re-articulate some kind of commitment to a two-state solution, or whether it's something much more difficult, especially for this Israeli government, like a hard freeze on any further settlements or settlement expansion, something that would almost certainly break apart his coalition, not to mention something on Temple Mount in terms of who's in control of security up there, which has been talked about recently, which I think is just way bridged too far for this Israeli government. Those questions, we don't know what the Palestinian component would be, but certainly the recent media reporting is that whether it's coming from the Americans or from the Saudis, there is now the introduction that we will need something on the Palestinian element as part of this larger package.
Thank you, John. It's very helpful. And so in the 2 minutes we have remaining, Larry, I'm going to try to sandwich in one last question for you. More generally, I think in the region, we're seeing, a combination of Iran getting closer than it's ever been to nuclear weapons capability, and accordingly, also more noise from Israel than we've ever heard before about readiness and urgency of military action. As an energy expert, do you price in the risks of conflict like that into your forecast for, I guess, not just supply and demand, but also price going forward? And in the scenarios I mentioned, do you see those reflected in forecasts for the future of energy supplies?
Interesting answer is no. And the way to see that is to look at the futures prices out over time. WTI today is $72 and change. December 2024, it's $67. If the market anticipated something, they're not pricing it, or they're not thinking about it, or they can be saying to themselves, there's nothing we can do about it. But in no way, shape, or form are we seeing it in the physical price market.
Very interesting. Well, I'm afraid we've run up against our hour. I don't want to take any more of our panelists' time. So Larry and John, I'd like to thank you again for all your thoughts and time today, and for what was a very illuminating discussion. To all those in our audience,
I want to thank John. I think it was brilliant. I learned a lot this morning. So thank you.
Oh, this is a mutual fan club, Larry. So we're on record as thank you, Larry, for participating. It's always just a brilliant, like I said, a masterclass before. I think Jonathan would agree.
Yeah, I get to shamelessly pick both your brains, so it's certainly in my self-interest to keep these conversations going. But to all those in our audience, thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again on another GINSA webinar. Have a good day and take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Larry.
Thanks both.
Thank you.